Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A session with Dr. Matt Lewis today. So it's the first first event we have in Trinity, and I hope everyone's had a great vacation and be ready for Trinity. And good luck with any exams if you have any. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Matt Lewis, who is a physical oceanographer in the university, Bangor University. So his research area is combining models of biological and physical processes to better understand the marine system, how they interact, how the process interact, how they might change under climate change, and also flooding risk, and even bioengineering, including marine renewables and offshore aquaculture. So this Q&A is linked to the talk that we have shared in our newsletter, and also that you can find under the description in this event. So there's a link to that, and that talk is Matt Matt has given earlier this year. That is on climate change and renewables and energy system. So it is about how climate change works, how there are many uncertainties in the climate model, and also more uncertainties given the renewables we have, and also the energy system and how demand will change in the future. So there are lots of uncertainties, and then the UK energy system is aiming to catch up with renewables to meet all the energy demand. However, there's still some way that we need to go. And in this talk, we can focus that, and we can talk about tidal energy as well as how the coast area will be affected by climate change. So I'll start with some Q&A questions for myself. But if you have any questions, please feel free to put in the chat box or on the comment section, and then we'll answer them during this session. So yeah, I'll start with one question. So Matt, I know your research area is on the coast. So what kind of insights could you share with us about the risk of coastal flooding under climate change or seawater intrusion, specifically maybe for the UK?
Thanks for the question. You can hear me, I presume? Yeah. Okay, so the climate models and also observations using satellites and tide gauges installed around the world have shown that the sea level is indeed rising. And that rise is not just because of the land sinking in some places, but so we have causation and correlation to sea level rise due to increased temperature. That observed increase is in line with the forecasts from the climate models, and that rise will compound flooding. So that mean sea level will combine with the tide going up and down and storms to produce extreme water levels. And in some places that can overtop or breach the coastal defences and cause flooding. In the UK, we use these climate models to predict just how much higher those extreme water levels will be. And we can put plans in place to mitigate those risks. So that's what the UK government's doing with its shoreline management plans of either building hard defences or moving people away from the area or something in between. There is, of course, some uncertainty with the higher end of those estimates, so far into the future, and also the interaction of some of those processes. So at Bangor, we have, I personally have quite a few students now looking at those interactions of those sources and the pathways. So that's how the floodwater can propagate onto the land, and also the receptors, because they all conspire to cause the risk. If that helps answer your question.
Yeah. So what about flooding in the UK? Would that be a major issue, major concern in the future?
Yes. Yes, I suppose so. A major flooding event was in 1953, and that really, I think, gave rise to the flood forecasting system that we have today, which has helped with many near-miss events, and also some forecasted well some smaller scale flood events. But as the seas rise and mitigation of the climate change sort of forecasted impacts are slow to occur, those events could occur more frequently and more severely. And so we're at a stage now where we're starting to plan with those shoreline management plans. So yes, it's one of the great challenges that's surrounding our nation of the UK, I think. I forget now, it's the second or third in the risk register from Lloyd's, I believe.
Okay. Then moving on to a bit more about tidal energy. So you have mentioned the intermittency of solar and wind, but tidal energy is more consistent. So do you think it has the potential of filling the renewable gap, in meeting the energy demand?
Yes, that's a great question. So the talk is trying to give a background to some of the reasons why we are installing a lot of renewable energy in our country, trying to mitigate and reduce our carbon footprints. And it goes into detail about some of the challenges that surrounds when we go from controllable sources of fossil fuel powered electricity systems to renewable energies that derive from the weather. So the tide, being an astronomical process, is not affected as much by the weather, and so it's much more regular and predictable. But there is a big challenge that I've tried to highlight in the talk, which is tidal energy is quite expensive. It's a very new industry compared to these much more mature forms. So therefore, it is quite a lot more expensive. And we're in a situation now where we are making decisions about renewable energy infrastructure based on that cost. So tidal energy could indeed, I believe, help a lot with that problem between supply and demand of electricity, but it would cost a lot more than we are willing to pay at the current time. So we've got some research now that's actually under review about how, if we installed some tidal energy in the UK at the sites that are well known about, in the Bristol Channel up in Scotland and such forth, it could actually reduce that intermittency of renewables, both in the short term, so on scales of minutes and hours, but also in that longer term scales, the seasons, so months and years. So yes, tidal energy would really help that, but it's unclear what's the most efficient cost associated with that. So we're now in this really interesting point in the UK where we've got decisions about how much storage we need for this renewable energy grid and what kind of storage that could be. So there's a great number of workshops going on right now where we're trying to understand the size of that storage and also whether we need a new sort of system. So maybe renewable energy powered hydrogen generation that could feed into a low carbon heating network and also be stored for much longer to help mitigate that. So there's the talk uses the word uncertainty a lot, but there's still a lot of uncertainty about which is the most cost effective system to have in place. Probably a mix of them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, of course. That's great. And then probably another question that always been raised about tidal energy or wind turbine is about the ecological impacts. So then would tidal energy, like those turbines, affect marine ecosystem?
That's a really good question, and that's something that wasn't discussed in the talk. But yes, anything you build will have an impact, of course, and it's about whether that impact is could be reduced, or if it's I guess less than the impact of other forms of renewable energy. So tidal energy has ecological and environmental impacts. You're displacing ecosystems, but you're also changing tidal dynamics, and that tidal dynamic controls mixing, that then controls the availability and transport of nutrients, but also the amount of sediment that's there that could affect these systems. For tidal range, for example, it can affect these intertidal areas. So building tidal lagoons or barrages may displace wetland and seabirds. And it's whether that impact is greater than the impact of other systems, should we say.
Other ways of potentially mitigating those impacts, like research on the way.
Yeah, that's right. So I think because for tidal energy, there's only a few examples now of installed systems with a measured amount of impact. What's not quite clear is if those impacts scale linearly, so they sort of increase at a rate that's in keeping with the amount of installed capacity that you build, or whether it could be exponential, so there could be combination hazards or combination impacts. So I guess, to put it simply, the impact of 1 megawatt developments, it could be X amount, but would the impact of a 2 megawatt development be twice the impact, or more or less? That part is not known, I suppose. But but yes, we're at that stage now where, you know, tidal stream turbines have been installed in Scotland at the Maygen site, and we've got this tidal range scheme, for example, in France, Lorence, and we can measure those impacts, and we are at the stage of quantifying that and using computer models to see what much larger scale impacts could be.
Great, thank you so much. Now we have a question from the audience, so we'll jump in with that. So this is from Ben. Ben says, thank you for your talk. You mentioned that we're already balancing some variability in demand and supply with French interconnector. So is the France more slightly different position to the UK regarding balancing renewable output because of the high share of nuclear?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know, but to keep it very simple, I don't actually know the answer, but I suspect it is partly that, and partly because because renewable energy systems convert the energy from the weather into electricity, the larger the spatial scale, then the smoother that aggregated electricity is. So the idea there is trading on a much larger scale, so Europe size, actually allows, there's much more ability to sort of trade between nations, if that helps. So to try and answer simply, it is not just France's nuclear, it is their great installed capacity for hydro as well, and it's that mix that allows that trading. Sadly, it's probably also driven by price. So so the electricity from France at a time of surplus might be well worth taking for the UK, just because of slight geographic differences. I hope that answered it. It's a very good question.
Yeah, indeed. So would you say maybe moving forward, if the UK is more connected with the continent in terms of energy, there'll be like greater chance, greater probability of us meeting the demand, and then kind of like full kind of complementing with renewables?
Yeah, I think we're at a really interesting point here where we have these interconnectors between nations, but also we're at a time of increased nationalism, should we say, and energy security is becoming much more of an important point, especially in people's pledges for the Paris Accord and their climate footprints, should we say. So I think government strategies may be to become more self-sufficient and more reliant, so larger amounts of installed capacity of renewables in their own nations. And it's how we can store that energy and redistribute it. That seems to me it's not my area of research, but it is a certain area of interest, is do we develop systems that can store that energy and provide it whenever people want? Or should we change to a system where we try to control when people want power? So have a variable pricing structure that would perhaps modify the demand side better. I don't think we're at a stage yet where we've decided as a nation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting part of it. It's about how do you change demand, do you change behaviors, do you change like the technical side? It's always like a debate, and maybe which way is the better one. We don't know. Kind of moving on in that direction, looking at how you talked about the energy demand has changed both in terms of like the absolute amount has reduced during the pandemic, and also about like the temporal distribution, about like the morning rush and in the evening going home, kind of peak demand. So is there any, and also seeing that now after the pandemic is not almost not entirely over, but then like we're already 1 year after it started, as the energy demand is rising again. So do you think there's something that we can learn from the pandemic regarding energy? Maybe like the energy transition or about our demand, like is it very plastic or anything?
That's yeah, that's a really interesting point. I haven't looked at the data enough to come up with an answer. I can only give you my opinion, but I think what it's taught us is that actually, considering the impact of what's happened in the last year and a bit, our behavior hasn't actually changed that much. We are rushing back to the old ways, as it were. And so, yeah, so I've sort of slightly forgot your question there, sorry, but I think what, if we've learned anything, that the amount of energy we use seems to just be going up and is seemingly unaffected in a larger context by the impacts of COVID. For example, the changes to our heating, you know, and the carbon footprint of our heating system has not changed at all. And so that's one thing I'm just trying to remember from a meeting I had a few weeks ago, where the carbon footprint of our heating network is much bigger than we perhaps initially assumed. And so, yeah, what have I learned from the COVID pandemic is probably that the decarbonization of our heating and cooling systems is probably the most important step, and the next step that we must take in the UK. So moving from electricity really to how to change homes being heated by natural gas really into something that's perhaps being powered by renewables. That's what I've learned anyway.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because to see like what is being impacted by the COVID-19 and what is not being impacted, and see how it's kind of hard to change people's behavior or just going back. So is that something that we can like make people change just because of the energy transition?
Yeah, it's really interesting there. Wouldn't it be great to discuss this with a load of social scientists, really? Because why we don't change is what's really interesting. You know, smoking, of course, is very dangerous and very bad for you, but people still smoke. The evidence for climate change is becoming overwhelming, and yet we don't change our behavior. Why is that? I mean, personally, for me, I think I'm quite selfish. You know, if I stop flying tomorrow and going on holidays, but my neighbours and my friends keep going on holiday, I'll just end up feeling very jealous. And I think that's probably the nub of the situation really here is the culture perhaps needs to change. It's very hard to do it at an individual level, but that's a very controversial thing to say, perhaps.
Yeah, we just got another question, also from Ben. So, any countries, in particular, leading the way in tidal energy?
Thanks, Ben. Great question. I'm probably biased, but I would say the UK because we have installed tidal stream energy online, and we're certainly leading the way in the research fields. Globally, there's a really interesting shift going on at the moment. Actually, the US Department of Energy has put a lot of money and effort into actually renewable energy systems for developing countries, so off-grid power solutions, as a way to support technological learning in tidal energy. So they're putting all their money, as it were, into creating small devices for a completely different application than we are. And they hope that through that development of that industry, it'll actually feed on to machines that can be connected to the electricity network. So they certainly are going at a very different angle to the sort of research and innovation that we are. Who's to say, I suppose. So those two kind of competing research ideas are really interesting to me. But certainly globally, China is, relatively speaking, China has become one of the leaders in wind power recently as well. And so too is Australia, actually. They're putting a lot of research money into renewable energy systems for Southeast Asia as well. So I think if I'd have to pick, I'd still be biased and say the UK, just because of its sheer history. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll jump in with another one of my questions. So how, I remember from your talk, you kind of emphasized on the uncertainty of modeling, both of climate projection and also the energy demand projections. So all these uncertainties. So just regarding more specifically about climate projections. So do you think how do we reconcile resources spent on trying to get those reduced uncertainties and actually just moving forward with those other ways of mitigating, adapting, or developing renewables? If uncertainties are so hard to reduce, is it worth to spend so much resources on that?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer. That's really the conclusion I was trying to draw in that talk was predicting the future is extremely difficult, and it's filled with uncertainty. So maybe we could come up with a new way of approaching the problem. I don't have that new way, but I wonder if we can use history to and transdisciplinary research to come up with something brand new, a new way to think about this challenge, if that makes sense. For example, there are many societies and communities around the world now, but also in the past, that have been quite resilient to extreme events. And I want to know why that was. I don't have an answer, but they don't rely on extremely expensive computer systems to forecast and predict extreme events. They either are resilient through their design of their communities or in the way that they react to the extreme event. That means that they do not need this challenging system of predicting the future to then mitigate against it. So I didn't answer your question at all. I'm sorry for that, but I think that's where I'm starting to come to in this understanding is it's a bit like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books, if you've ever read that. We need to kind of we need to come away from this idea of trying to use Newtonian laws of cause and effect to try and understand what's going to happen in the future, and maybe think about the system quite differently. I hope that helped.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. Yeah, just a reminder to the audience, we have about 5 minutes left in this Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it in. Or if we don't get through them today, feel free to still put it in. We'll email Matt and make sure to get the answers back to you. So now we're going to move on to another question from Justin. But bit of digression from the previous discussion, but how important is individual level contribution to climate change, to CO2 emissions, compared to the industry level?
Well, that's a good question, and again, I'm very impressed with the level of questioning here. I can't answer this, but an individual's choice in the system that we live in feeds into industry, I believe. Where we live in a capitalist system, so your consumer right and your consumer choice impacts industry. If you choose to purchase things more ethically, then that will impact upon the industry. So individualism and individual choice is really the driver here, I think. I think that answers the question. So individuals, it starts with the individual, I believe. Now,
Yeah,
how to change an individual's behavior, that's the interesting bit. Is it through education or something? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a great point. How like individuals translate into more industry. Also, I feel like how to make sure that if I do it, other people do it as well. Like you said, if you do go on holidays, so that other people keep on going on holidays, and then that you like, how can you make sure that you continue your way, and also to make sure that my contribution can kind of like help others, like combine with others to actually translate into a big scale effect.
Yeah. Yes, it's really interesting to me, this sort of side of things, and it comes along to this other point as well. You know, we're walking into this place perhaps where we're using this idea of the Internet of Things and gathering more and more data into our models to predict the future, so we can have less resilient, I believe, less resilient but cheaper systems in place. Which is fine until you get a true night of uncertainty. A little bit like hospital beds in COVID. It was cheaper to have very efficient, streamlined hospitals until, as Donald Rumsfeld said, the unknown unknowns come along, and then you don't have enough capacity in your system. Well, the same is perhaps true in a future energy system, where if we use more and more data to try and get better at predicting what will happen, we'll have a cheaper energy system, it's true, but we may not be as resilient to these night and uncertainties that come along. Sorry, so that was a slight aside, but I thought it was important. It links to these other questions.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's for the end of our chat. Sorry, we have another question that came into the chat. I don't think we'll have time to answer it. But I'll make sure email that to Matt and then get back to you. So sorry about that, but thank you for your question. And thank you everyone for watching this. And then hopefully we'll see you soon in Trinity, or maybe if not in Micromus. Thank you. And thank you, Matt, for an interesting talk.
Well, thank you for letting me talk about it. I've really enjoyed this. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Goodbye.